In this story filled with love and loss, Grace's journey has touched us all. If you're moved by her path, please subscribe to our channel and join us in witnessing her emotional journey. Grace had no code beeper, but old habits died hard. She jolted awake immediately when the operator announced the code. Grabbed her clothes and raced from the annex when she heard the room number, not even taking time to wonder where Jimmy had vanished to or to close the door behind her. Who cared if she was discovered? It was Cat in trouble. Procedures and protocols as familiar as a catechism ran through her mind. It had been 4 years, but there were some things you just never forgot. Like how to save a life. When she reached Cat's room, nurses were milling around, one sliding a board under the girl's seizing body, another holding oxygen near her blue-tinged face. A third was pushing a crash cart in from the hallway, his face red with the effort. How long's she been seizing? Grace took control of the situation, and no one questioned her presence or her authority. She moved to the head of the bed, replacing the oxygen mask with a bag, carefully forcing oxygen into Cat's lungs. 17 minutes. Valium given per protocol, but no response. Give me 800 of phosphonitoin, and draw up 500 milligrams of phenobarb. More people began to fill the room and Grace handed over control of Cat's airway to a respiratory therapist. She pushed the anticonvulsant medication into the foreline in Cat's forearm. Nothing more to do now except wait for the drugs to take effect. She stroked Cat's shoulder as the girl's body continued to buck and strain. Then after several minutes that seemed like an eternity, the seizure slowed. Grace yanked a stethoscope from a hovering resident and listened. Cat was breathing normally again. Get me a set of vitals, start her on 100% oxygen by mask. The crowd slowly dissipated, most of the residents and medical students disappointed by the anticlimactic resuscitation. No chance to perform any invasive procedures, or even to practice an intubation. They grumbled over the missed sleep Cat had stolen from them and yawned their way back to their call rooms. Who the hell are you? A woman asked from the doorway as Grace felt Cat's pulse. Grace looked up, giving Cat's hand a reassuring squeeze. The woman marched into the room as if she owned it, tall and regal, her blonde hair so pale it seemed almost transparent in the harsh gleam of the fluorescent lights. Dr. D'Angelo, Grace told her. She didn't like this woman. Something about her brought forth the memory of the panic attack she'd experienced yesterday, when she was trapped inside the revolving doors. Her mouth filled with the taste of copper salts and burnt flesh. She wasn't leaving Cat here, not alone with this woman. Eve Warden. The witch? Warden flicked a penlight over Cat's pupils, quickly assessed her patient's reflexes and respiratory status before looking up at Grace once more. Her eyes were the color of steel, flat, without depth. Hard as steel, too, Grace thought, but she met the woman's gaze without flinching. I'm Dr. Eve Warden, head of the ECU, and this girl is my patient. The woman dismissed Grace with an impervious wave of her hand. Then her eyes narrowed and cut back to Grace, focusing on her face. Grace had the sudden feeling that this woman knew who she was. The urge to run was overwhelming. She tightened her grip on Cat's hand, more for her own protection than the girl's. Warden's gaze took in Grace's scrubs. Where was the hospital ID, the paraphernalia of a doctor on duty? The questions burned through Warden's expressionless gaze. Then Warden arched an eyebrow, focusing on the bright row of staples along Grace's left temple. And she smiled. Cat was all right now, Grace told herself, as she released her grip on the now sleeping girl. She despised the wave of fear that knotted her stomach, but she couldn't stay here, not with this woman. Before she could turn tail and flee, Warden reached out a hand, taking Grace's. Grace gave a tiny whimper, shaming herself with her cowardice, and tried to pull away. Panic now gripped her, the buzzing wasps joined by darts of fire that raced from Warden's grip to consume Grace, paralyzing her. It's Grace, isn't it? Grace Moran? Warden asked, her eyes of liquid steel plunging into Grace's soul like daggers. The blood fled from Grace's face, replaced by icy fingers that burnt and choked, stopping her breath before air could reach her lungs, mingling with the terrific roar of wasps, and the jolts of fiery pain that seared her limbs. Her chest was being crushed from inside and without as a red haze filled her vision. No need to wait for the tumor to do its job. The mere touch of this woman, the sound of her voice, and Grace was about to die. Chapter 24. The tower. Jimmy tore down the 4 flights of stairs, as if pursued by a banshee. The damn clogs clip-clopped with a fury of noise that reverberated like shotgun blasts, enough to wake the dead. If he had breath enough, the thought would have made him laugh. As it was, it only spurred him faster until he almost tripped over his own feet as he plunged through the door to pediatrics. The children's ward was dark, only the dim lights of the nurse's station in the middle of the corridor shed any light. The entire unit was silent except for the faint beeping of a distant monitor. Jimmy slowed his steps, clutching the too small lab coat around him, as if it would hide him from prying eyes. He kept his gait quiet, heading down the hallway to Alex's room. He arrived without incident and pushed the door open. To his surprise, Alex was wide awake, staring at the door as if waiting for him. Surrounding him were the 3 bald girls. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Alex said. One of the girls, a skinny lass with gorgeous blue eyes that looked all the larger given her missing eyelashes, hugged him in sympathy. Heather, Jimmy remembered. The girls looked at him as if they knew who he was, accepted his presence without question. "Maybe," Jimmy said, not wanting to cause the boy more distress. Alex was already breathing hard and fast, drawing in oxygen from a machine that fit over his forehead and face like a horse's bridle. "Is it Kat? I heard them page her room number." The machine whistled as Alex sucked in air. "Where's Grace? She was supposed to be here." "My name's Jimmy. Grace sent me to keep you company." Alex slit his eyes at him, scrutinizing Jimmy. Jimmy stepped forward, offering a hand. Alex stared at it a long moment, as if expecting a trick, then finally took it. Then he surprised Jimmy by reaching for Jimmy's left hand as well. The boy twisted Jimmy's wedding ring between his fingers. "This is just like Grace's. You were with her yesterday, after she got trapped in the doors." He turned to the girls gathered beside his bed. "She's in trouble, isn't she?" The girls remained silent, but they all bobbed their heads in affirmation. Jimmy watched the strange tableau, the glimmer of a plan beginning to form in his mind. "Do you think you sweet lasses could give me a hand?" he asked in his most charming voice. "Take a stroll across the skyway for me. Fetch Grace back." The eldest of the girls, Tiffany, smiled at that. Just as Jimmy began to relax, thinking he'd found his answer in these 3 girls, she cocked her hand on her hip, as only women knew how to do. The other 2 looked to her, waiting for her answer. "Sorry, Jimmy. We are not allowed to leave the floor." Jimmy wrapped his hand around the bed rail, his grasp threatening to dent the metal. "It'll be all right," he wheedled, hating the desperation that crept into his voice. "I'll be with you most of the way." "But not all the way," Brittany put in. Alex turned to the girls. "Can't you help? It's for Grace." Heather gave him another hug, then all 3 joined hands and began to stroll from the room. "Don't worry, Alex. You can do it." She blew a kiss to both Jimmy and Alex, then they were gone. Jimmy looked at the pale wraith of a child dwarfed by the bed and the machines surrounding him. What good were the 2 of them? A ghost-turned man, who couldn't even cross a damn bridge, and a boy resembling a ghost, who would never be able to make it that far without collapsing. Could he risk this boy's life by sending him into the darkness of the tower? Grace felt her soul slipping away, being drained from her. Her body swayed against Kat's bed, Eve Warden's claw-like hand gripping hers. God, she had no idea it would hurt this bad. she thought, as red-hot flames of pain possessed her, blinding her to everything except Kat's face, peaceful, at rest. She had to fight, couldn't abandon Kat to the witch. Struggling to breathe, she tried to pull her hand away from Eve's grip. The other woman only squeezed tighter, her talons digging into Grace's skin, her beady eyes devouring Grace's strength like a cosmic vampire. "Is Kat all right?" Alex's voice warbled its way through the air, a gasp of breath punctuating each word. And Grace was saved. Eve turned her gaze to the defenseless boy. Alex struggled to keep on his feet as he leaned against the doorframe, breathless with exertion. A shudder raced through Grace's body, chasing away the fire and ice, drowning the wasps as she gulped in fresh air. She couldn't let Eve Warden take these children. She wouldn't. "Of course, honey." Eve's syrupy sweet tone pealed out like a bell. "Why don't you go back to bed?" "Go, Alex. Go." Grace fought to bring voice to the words, but her breath still came in short gasps. She slid her hand from Eve's, amazed her fingers weren't burnt to a crisp, and clutched at the bedrail. Alex took a deep inhalation that reverberated through the room, then took the 3 steps needed to move to Grace's side. He reached out a hand to Grace, clasping hers in the strong grip climbers shared. She wrapped her fingers around his bony wrist and was able to breathe once more. A warm tingle of energy seemed to flow from her to Alex and back again. "Jimmy sent me," he told her. If she had the energy, Grace would have laughed. Of course Jimmy sent him, which meant that Alex could see her ghost of a husband also. Her stomach fluttered with the memory of the passion she and Jimmy had shared mere hours ago. What the hell was happening to her? To all of them? She straightened and reached her other hand to Kat's limp one, drawing the unconscious girl into the circuit of energy. "Kat's going to be fine." She spoke the words not just for Alex's benefit, but as a promise to Warden, her eyes meeting the other physicians with a crackle of energy. Before Eve could reply, Vincent rushed into the room. He took in the tableau, his hands smoothing his rumpled scrubs, tightening the drawstring of his pants. Grace noted Eve's possessive smile as she gazed upon the flustered pediatric Ian. "What happened?" Vincent asked. "Just a seizure." Eve dismissed the almost fatal event as incidental. "I'm glad you're here, Dr. Embark," she said, moving to take his arm, but her gaze darted back to Grace. "Look who I've found. Our missing patient. Grace Moran." Vincent flushed and Grace realized that he hadn't betrayed her to Eve. Maybe there was hope for him yet. "No," Alex said, clutching Grace with both hands now. She reached an arm around his shoulders, supporting his weight as his body sagged against hers. "You promised, Vincent." Eve's laughter etched through the air, the brittle sound of icicles smashing. "You need to go back to your room, Alex. We'll take good care of your friend." Alex ignored Eve, his stare capturing Vincent. Vincent shifted his weight, obviously uncomfortable with the confrontation. His hair was disheveled and he looked disoriented, unable to focus or make eye contact with any of them except Eve Warden. "Please, Vincent," Alex said, his voice raspy as he gathered his breath. "You promised." Vincent looked at Eve, then at Grace. "Do you remember your promise?" he asked Grace. "You'll wait in Alex's room until morning." Alex squeezed Grace's arm. She nodded mutely, trying to understand the silent communication flowing between Vincent and Eve. The other woman flounced and took Vincent's arm in a possessive grip. "As long as Grace is back in time to begin her therapy," she said, glancing over her shoulder with those flat, mirror-like eyes that threatened to devour everything they saw. "Come on, Vincent. We need to discuss Catherine's treatment plan. I think it's imperative that we do anything we can to get her to surgery before something further can happen. Something serious." Vincent looked back at Grace with eyes glazed with confusion. Grace bit her lip. He expected her to choose him. Alex squeezed her hand harder. It was either Vincent or the children. The witch, Eve Warden, demanded a sacrifice. Vincent was a grown man, capable of protecting himself. Disappointment filled his face when Grace remained silent, allowing Eve to lead him from Kat's room. Alex looked down on Kat's face, peaceful in sleep, and felt like crying. Even with Jimmy's help, he couldn't get here any sooner, couldn't protect her. He'd let her down. Despite her shaved head and the bristle of electrodes poking out from the white gauze surrounding it, she was beautiful, and he loved her more than life itself. Would have gladly given his life, what little of it that was left, as worthless as a body slowly consuming itself was, if it would save Kat. "She's going to be all right," Grace told him, her voice firm now. She squeezed his hand in encouragement. He thought about the way she faced the witch, and he looked up at her with awe. Could he ever be that brave? "She hates sleeping, afraid she won't wake up again," he told Grace, his eyes on Kat. "I know." Grace sighed. "Let's get you back to your room. You need your oxygen and a breathing treatment. Will you come back and stay with her?" he asked as Grace lifted him into her arms and carried him from Kat's bedside. "Watch over her." "Yes, I will." Alex relaxed in her arms, gathering all his energy to breathe, certain that Grace wouldn't let him down. Chapter 25: The In-Between. Jimmy paced furiously along the annex side of the skyway, his gaze focused on the double doors at the tower end, willing them to open. 8 steps, that was all he had. 8 steps. Any farther and the world span out of control, turning him inside out, whirling him into blackness. Bloody hell. His anguished shout echoed from the glass ceiling and windows, returning to mock him. He pounded a fist against the window closest to him, cursing the pain. What was the good of being alive if he was forced to stand here, useless, reduced to sending a dying boy in his stead to protect Grace? If Leo were here, Jimmy would have gleefully chucked him through one of the windows, heaven and hell and damnation notwithstanding. He'd never felt so helpless in his entire life. The thought brought him up short. He stared at his reflection in the dark glass. The overhead spotlights cast him in an unearthly glow. Wind shook the glass and the image wavered, as he remembered another time and place when he'd felt even more desperately helpless. A night 4 years ago. Grace had rushed in to save him, despite the risks to herself, while he'd watched in a half-trance as he drifted in and out of consciousness, seeing exactly what that monster did to her, listening to Grace plead not for her own life, but for his. His shudder threatened to topple him, as the memory crashed over him. Maybe oblivion had its upside, he thought as he forced the memories aside. Maybe there were some things worse than death. Like living with the torment of that memory every day. He whirled away from the window and charged down the narrow skyway once more, determined to save Grace. "Please Lord, this time, let me help her." A vortex of blackness overtook him. Lightning struck the glass roof above him, shaking the entire structure. An arc of electricity split the darkness, ribbons of blue cascading from one lighting fixture to the next. Brilliant sparks flew and the lamps exploded, the noise and light and smell of burnt wires thundering through his brain. He felt himself falling. It seemed to take an eternity for his body to fly through the air. When he opened his eyes, he was sitting on the floor, back against the annex doors. Right where he started. Patience, the word whispered through his brain. Have faith. Jimmy struggled to his feet, every muscle groaning in protest. Oh, he had faith that Grace needed him, faith in the power of their love, faith that there was no way in this life, or the next that he was going to let her down again. He braced himself for another attempt, swallowing against the waves of pain that lanced through his body. Grace was over there. God only knew what was happening to her. The doors opened and there she was. The light behind her bathed her in a golden glow for a moment, her and the boy she cradled in her arms. The doors swung shut again, and she was shrouded in the shadows that engulfed the skyway. Speechless with joy, he watched her stumble through the distance that separated them. He rushed forward to meet her, stopping at his 8-pace limit. Then she was there, in his arms where she belonged. The boy didn't protest as Jimmy's bare hug crushed him between them. Jimmy wasn't certain it would matter if he had, his joy at seeing her was that overwhelming. She raised her head and before she could say anything, he captured her lips with his, burrowing into the kiss, as if that one taste would need to sustain him a lifetime. Her body trembled and shook in his. He lowered his arms to take the boy's weight. Still she shook, her skin chilled as if she were the one returned from the grave. Jimmy never wanted the moment to end. He now realized what she was so terrified of, why she had so desperately resisted admitting that he had returned to her. The pain of leaving her would break him, destroy him just as surely as the void brother Leo warned of. Her touch, this feeling of vitality, was intoxicating, addictive. He well understood why it had driven others before him to madness. Of course, they didn't have grace. She was all he needed. All he had ever wanted. Finally, far too quickly, she broke free of his embrace, leaving the boy in his arms. "Thank you," she said, her fingers trailing through his hair, telegraphing whispers of the passion they'd shared earlier. "For sending Alex. He saved my life." The boy turned his head from his position on Jimmy's shoulder to look up at that. "I did?" he asked, taking a pause to catch his breath between the words. Jimmy felt a pang of envy at the loving expression Grace turned on the boy. She slid her fingers down to rumple Alex's hair. "You did. You're my hero." Thunder echoed from the night beyond. Jimmy shifted the boy's weight and stepped to the annex doors. "We'd best get this one back where he belongs." He stopped after 2 steps. Grace wasn't following. Instead she had turned to face the tower once more. "I have to go back," she said, her voice a sorrowful whisper that barely overcame the rain rattling the glass surrounding them. Jimmy almost dropped the boy as anguish lanced through him. "No," the syllable was torn from him, sliced through the darkness that separated them. She looked up at him, her lips set in a hard line, eyes wide with sorrow. "No," he repeated, taking a step toward her. "You can't. I won't allow it. We don't have much time, don't waste it on foolishness, damn it." The smile she gave him was filled with pain. God, he never wanted to hurt her so. But he was only human now. "I can't leave Kat alone," she said. She reached out a hand, cupped his chin in it. "Someone has to stay with her." "No, Grace, no," he was begging now, but he didn't care. All his pride had fled with the thought of her leaving him again. "Please, no. The girl, she'll be fine. I'm sure she will. If you go, I'm not sure you'll make it back to me." "I will," she promised, stepping up on tiptoe to kiss him once more. "We'll still have tomorrow." Jimmy was helpless to control the tears that broke past his dam of self-restraint. She lowered her head to face Alex, giving him a quick peck on the forehead. "My hero. You'll watch over Jimmy, won't you?" "Yes, Grace. I will," the boy replied solemnly. Jimmy clutched the boy to him with a tight grip that had to be painful, but Alex never complained. Thank God, because the boy was the only thing Jimmy had to hold on to, the only thing keeping him anchored, preventing him from rushing after Grace, as she crossed the dark skyway and vanished into the tower. He stood there, unashamed of the tears flowing down his cheeks, or the trembling that overtook his body when the doors shut behind her. Would have stood there for an eternity, waiting for her return, if it wasn't for the boy. "Guess we'd better get back," Alex said in a breathless gasp. Jimmy looked down and for the first time saw that the boy's face was an alarming shade of blue. He said, reluctantly turning back to the annex doors. "Hey, Jimmy," Alex said as Jimmy carried him to the elevators. "Know any good stories?" Eve drew Vincent into her office, closing the door behind her, ensuring their privacy. She felt his confusion. Good, she would use that. Earlier he'd called out a name that wasn't hers, Grace Moran's. So the naive chief resident had more up his sleeve than even Eve had imagined. He'd been hiding Hellman's precious patient from the chief, and all too obviously had fallen in love, or at least lust with the woman. Grace D'Angelo Moran. Did she think Eve such a dunce that she wouldn't recognize a patient she'd put to sleep a few days ago? And Moran had the audacity to waltz into Eve's own unit, her territory, where she reigned supreme, had fought and sacrificed much to win and interfere with the care of Eve's patient. Eve turned away, to hide her grin from Vincent. Oh, she'd make Moran pay for her trespass, dearly. And that whelp of a girl, too. It was high time that Jellicle learned how to respect her elders. By the time she looked back at Vincent, she'd assumed a look of wide-eyed wonder colored with a hint of embarrassment. I know you'll think me terribly naive, she started, her voice halting, but I don't have much experience with men. The lies came easily, effortlessly, as she continued to stroke his ego. No one's ever made me feel like that, she faltered, hanging her head, as if afraid to continue. I just hope it meant as much to you as it did to me, she finished with a note of wistfulness calculated to break any male's heart. Right on cue, Vincent's wonderfully strong hands grasped her shoulders, turning her gently to face him. Eve, he started, his face filled with compassion and desire. Eve knew how to fan those fires. SSH, don't say anything, don't make any promises you can't keep, she asked, placing a trembling finger over his lips. Just hold me, please. His arms drew her in close, his lips brushing against her hair. She raised her face to his and his lips met hers. Point, set, and match, Eve thought as she moved to rekindle the passion they'd shared earlier. After she was done with him, Vincent Embark would be lucky to remember his own name, much less that of Grace Moran. Grace barely made it through the doors at the end of the skyway without falling down. Wasps buzzed all around, under her skin, biting and stinging so that every inch of her being was lanced with fire. The shotgun booming in her head echoed with every heartbeat, every breath, each step that took her closer to the ECU. The calm she'd felt in Jimmy's arms had been shattered the instant she turned back to return to the tower. But she couldn't abandon Kat, leave her here alone. She managed to push through the doors of the ECU, and, finally out of sight of Jimmy and Alex, allowed herself to slump against the wall. She blinked back tears of pain and decided that she'd take Kat back to Alex's room where both she and Jimmy could watch over her. Only had to make it a few more steps, that was all. The smell of burning flesh assaulted her, doubling her over with nausea, and her vision went red as she stumbled into Kat's room. And found it empty. Chapter 26 Graveyard Shift. So it's a story you're wanting? Jimmy asked Alex once he had him snuggled safe and sound, back in his bed, oxygen machine hooked up. The boy looked up at him, his color better, but Jimmy didn't care for the dark circles that rimmed his eyes or the sunken appearance to his cheeks. The boy didn't have much strength left or much time. How much had he sacrificed rushing in to help Grace? Yes, please, Alex answered. Grace told us about when you and her met and Queen Maeve. Jimmy smiled. Yes, he knew. He stretched out beside the boy and curled his arm around his shoulder. One of his greatest regrets was that he and Grace never had the chance to have children. Grace would have made a wonderful mother. He would have dearly loved to have seen her chasing down a handful of munchkins. And he didn't think he'd make such a bad father, either. But she didn't tell you how Maeve saved her people. Or how Grace herself saved half the world. Or how she saved me. Of course, now that he thought on it, some of that was Brother Leo's doing as well. He frowned. How far did the good brother's power reach? He kept saying all he did was influence events. Meddling was more like it. Grace saved the world? Alex asked, resting his head against Jimmy's chest. I believe it. I wish she really was my mom. Jimmy couldn't help himself, he tilted his head down and kissed the top of the boy's head. She loves you like a son. Alex sighed in contentment, then after a long moment of silence, stirred himself and looked up at Jimmy. My story. I cap N. Let's see. How in hell was he to focus on a story when all he could think of was Grace alone over there? Leo hadn't given him any details of what dangers she might face, only that dire consequences were in store if she chose to remain in the tower. Alex tugged on his arm impatiently. All right then. You already know of Queen Maeve and how she almost lost her people during the dark time. From who? Space invaders. No, something much worse. You see, there once upon a time was an island known to some as Thera, known to others as Atlantis. The people who lived there called it Calist. A long, long time ago, the volcano that made up the island exploded. The sky rained fire. The sea churned into tidal waves taller than the Empire State Building. He was exaggerating here, but the boy would never know. And everything in the world changed. What happened? Those waves sucked the water from the Red Sea just as Moses was leading his people to safety, then the water surged forward to crush the Pharaoh's army. The ocean devoured Atlantis. Almost the entire island fell into the sea. The part that was left was covered in ash. Even to this day, as the scientists dig it out, they are finding beautiful artwork and lovely houses, but Jimmy lowered his voice for effect, not a single body. They all disappeared. Everyone. An entire civilization. Whoa, Alex breathed out. The explosion was so massive that the earth shook for days after. And the sky was so dark that the sun was blocked out. Everlasting night. Alex's eyes grew wide. Fierce storms raged over all the lands and ash rained down from the skies, even as far away as Maeve's land, half a globe away. Winter came months early and never left. There was snow in July. People prayed to their gods, thinking they were being punished. They turned on each other, fighting for what little food remained, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. No one was safe. What did Maeve do? Well, now. She was one very smart queen. She saved her people and kept them alive, hoping for the sun to return. Crops were blighted, livestock starved, people frozen to death, but Maeve kept her people alive during the dark time. How? She had a secret weapon. The same secret weapon that Grace found 3,000 years later and used to save more people. A secret weapon. What was it? Excalibur. A magic ring. No, I know. A ray gun sent by space invaders. Jimmy shook his head, wishing Grace were here to see the boy's enthusiasm. Wishing Grace were here, period. No. None of those. Maeve found the lost treasure of Atlantis. Grace, someone whispered her name. She whirled around, searching the emptiness of Kat's room. Had she actually heard it, or was the tumor playing more tricks? The scent of burnt flesh assaulted her once more. Was this some new kind of seizure? Was she hallucinating? Come out wherever you are, a second voice joined the first. But it came from a different direction. Grace stepped back out into the hallway. All of the patients' doors stood ajar, winking at her, darkness behind them. Grace, come and play. A low sing-song came from the room directly across from her. Angie, the anorexic's room. Grace glanced down the hall at the nurse's station. The two nurses were closeted in the medication room, appeared to be doing inventory. The ward clerk's back was to her as he lounged in his chair, headsets covering his ears, his body rocking to an unheard melody. She took a deep breath and found the strength to cross the hall. She pushed open the door to Angie's room. Rain pelted the window, echoing through the space. Grace turned the light on. It was empty. Down here, Grace. Another whisper, this one a man's voice, beckoned her. She stepped back out into the hallway and looked at the doors lining the opposite side. Was Kat behind one of them? Or should she check the treatment rooms on the other side of the nurse's station? For a long moment the hall was quiet. The pounding in her head and the wasps fell silent as well. The only noise was the thundering of her heart and the rush of air as she sucked in a breath and slowly pivoted, turning to look past the nurse's station. At the far end of the hallway, the beast's door stood open. "Treasure?" Alex asked. "Was it gold? How did it save her people?" Jimmy smiled at the youngster's enthusiasm. It helped him to put aside his fears for Grace. Alone in the darkness. Alex yanked on his arm. "Tell me more." Maeve moved her people to the coast, hoping the sea would provide sustenance. But the endless night had killed off most of the fish as well. And soon others came, fighting them for what little they had. Maeve knew she couldn't keep her people safe for much longer, not as the bitter cold of the true winter approached. Their second winter of darkness. The treasure, how'd she find the treasure? Jimmy gave Alex a stern look at his interruption, and the boy clamped his hand over his mouth. Jimmy chuckled and continued. Despite her own desperate need, Maeve offered shelter to a traveling druid. He entertained her people with his ballads and poems and in return for her hospitality, told Maeve about weird lights seen on the Forbidden Isles off the coast to the south. Islands that legend held were the home to the Selkies, the ancient sea people. He described strange wreckage of unfamiliar ships, larger than any curragh or boat Maeve's people used. Ships that could sail to the end of the world and back. Maeve was intrigued, stirred by the hope that these strangers, whether they were Selkies or some other clan chased by the strange weather from their own lands, might be able to save her own people. She took a few of her most trusted men with her, left the rest to protect her people, and they set out for the Forbidden Isles. As he told the story, Jimmy wondered if that druid had been named Leo or some variation. The bugger sure did get around, hadn't been lying when he said he'd been planning, preparing the seeds for eons. He caught his breath, wishing for a pipe to punctuate, with as his dad had used when Jimmy bounced on his knee. No need with Alex, though. The boy's eyes were fixed on Jimmy's mouth, eagerly waiting for him to continue. It was a rough crossing, as if the seas themselves were aligned against Maeve and her quest to save her people. And the islands, he frowned and shook his head in wonder. Barren crags of rock jutting from the ocean, as if the sea had chewed them up and spit them out again. The sea spun around the rocks, aiming to smash Maeve's curragh to bits, trying its best to swallow Maeve and her crew whole. The small boat was swamped, almost smashed to bits on the rocky cliffs. Maeve was tossed into the ocean, felt the water crush her in its angry fist as it pulled her under, hoping only that by taking her, it would spare her comrades. "What happened?" Alex asked, his fingers squeezing Jimmy's wrist. "She woke up to find herself in a strange house, with even stranger people. Dark-haired, dark-skinned, they spoke a strange musical language as they nursed her back to health. Over time, Maeve learned enough of their language and they learned some of hers, and were able to eventually communicate. They came from a faraway island called Calist, had traveled across several seas in the ship that had become their shelter. Maeve realized that this shelter, large enough to house 24 families, was actually the body of their boat, hauled out of the water and turned upside down. She'd never dreamed of a boat that size, or of the other wonders the Callista revealed. Intricate pulleys and winches that allowed one man to do the work of three, a machine that charted the sea and kept them from getting lost, ways to work metal so that it was lighter, stronger than any she'd ever seen, and most important, their sacred treasure. They were from Atlantis. What was the treasure? How did it save Maeve's people? The words tumbled from Alex in a rush. Then he frowned. Hey, this happened like thousands of years ago. How did the treasure help Grace? How did Grace save the world with Maeve's treasure? Now. That was the question, now wasn't it? How much of what had happened 5 years ago had been because of Grace and how much was Brother Leo's meddling? Jimmy thought back to the months before they were married. The year hadn't begun so well. Grace was still living in her East Liberty apartment, and every time he visited her his car would be vandalized, or he'd have a run-in with one of the street thugs who seemed to think he owned Grace's block. What a strange courtship it had been, he working all hours, poring over images of ancient documents, getting up in the middle of the night to teleconference with scholars around the world. And Grace, finishing her residency, working in the ER, flying in helicopters, rescuing strangers, rescuing him. In more ways than one. He remembered the night she finally agreed to marry him. It was past midnight, and he was still in his office at the university, working in darkness except for the glow of his computer screen, as he pieced together translations of ancient Minoan texts that recorded a strange tale from an island in the north. He hunched over the computer, flashing back and forth from one garbled bit of text to another, a headache wrapping his skull in an anaconda's grip, and one eyelid fluttering from fatigue. But he knew he was close, so close, and kept working, fearful that he would lose the thinnest tendrils of an idea if he quit. Just as he found the thread that unified the snippets of ancient history, a pair of strong arms wrapped around his neck, and Grace leaned her head down to join his as she read the words on the screen. Yuck! Poor Maeve, almost drowned, then only to return home and find her brother has turned everyone into cannibals. Not everyone, Jimmy said, twisting in his chair to tug her onto his lap. Some of them they ate. To see them through the endless night. Yeah, I've heard it before. Atlantis go bang, dust clouds in the sky, no summer or sun for 2 years, chaos, savagery, calamity. He pulled back to look at her closely. This was so unlike her, she was as fascinated with Maeve and her story as he was. Her shoulders were slumped. She still wore her surgical scrubs, which meant she'd left the ER as soon as her shift was over, not even bothering to change into street clothes like she usually did. She shifted her weight, her fingers running through his hair, and the light of the computer screen illuminated several tiny specks of what could only be dried blood in front of her left ear, where her surgical mask wouldn't protect her. Rough night? He asked. Want to talk? In answer she began to unbutton his shirt. She buried his mouth beneath hers, drowning him in her need and hunger. Of course not, he thought. She never wanted to talk about the bad things. The things that went wrong, that she was helpless to prevent. The times she failed to outsmart death. Their kiss deepened as he wrapped his arms around her, allowing her to draw on his strength. Her entire body was knotted with tension, but slowly she began to relax. She had his shirt open, was playing with the sparse hairs on his chest, drawing her fingers lower and lower as she squirmed on his lap. Sex primal, pure, passionate celebration of life that was Grace's answer to death, to chaos. It was an ancient ritual, one that Jimmy understood on an intellectual level, and enjoyed immensely on a physical one. Afterwards, he had taken her home to her apartment in East Liberty. Won't you marry me, Grace? He asked yet again. Sooner or later he would wear her down, he was certain. At least move out of this dump and into my place. She merely shook her head, and they continued trudging up the steps to her third-story apartment. Jimmy forced himself not to sigh. He hadn't expected her to acquiesce, but still he always hoped. For all her quiet upbringing with the monks and nuns, she often seemed like a wild animal, skittish, afraid to stray too close for fear of being captured. For Grace, though, it wasn't only fear of losing her independence. It was a deeper, greater fear that Jimmy worried no amount of love would conquer. A fear of being abandoned. Anger rose, as always when he thought of the careless disregard of the so-called mother, who had left her, discarded her like trash instead of cherishing her for the treasure she was. A treasure he'd hunted for his entire life, and refused to lose now. He grabbed her arm, spun her so her back was to the wall, and kissed her hard, allowing his frustration to speak for itself. What was that for? She asked when they finally separated. Just letting you know what you're missing by not moving in with me. She narrowed her eyes at him and gave him a twisted smile. You're never home anyway. Always with your other woman, Queen Maeve. I'd be left alone with only the dog for company. She continued up the stairs and he followed. I don't have a dog. Fitting her key in her door, she turned and nodded. See, that's what you're missing. It's not me you need. Yes, yes it is, he insisted, reaching for her arm once more, ready to prove it yet again. She darted away, pushing her door open and rushing into the dark apartment. Before Jimmy could step inside, there was a crash followed by the sickening thud of a body falling. Grace? He raced over the threshold, but was immediately bowled over by an unseen assailant. The clamor of pounding footsteps echoed down the hall. Jimmy bolted to his feet and fumbled for the light switch. Grace was slowly regaining her feet from her spot on the other side of the couch. He grabbed me, threw me across the room, she said, her eyes wide, darting around the room, searching the shadows for hidden danger. Are you all right? Did you see him? Where did he go? Jimmy was frozen, stunned by what had happened, torn between the need to go to her and the desire to catch the intruder and beat him to a bloody pulp. His fingernails dug into the skin of his palms and he raised his clenched fists, staring at them in wonder. Never once in his entire life had he ever wanted to do violence to any man. Never once until tonight. The thought made him feel more than a little sick. The sight of Grace, her face red with a bruise that was already forming on her cheekbone, made him ready to vomit. He spun to the door, took one step before realizing the futility of giving chase, and instead reached for the phone on the hall table. As he dialed 911, he walked around the couch to where Grace stood, looking around the small apartment, as if she were lost. Why she broke off as he pulled her close to him, buried her face in his chest. She didn't cry, didn't break down, merely stood there shivering as the fear overtook her. He didn't care, she was safe and in his arms, and she was going home with him. For good. The next morning Jimmy had brought an assorted collection of grad students and friends, and they had moved Grace into his house. He remembered that Sunday morning. Brother Leo had joined them, bringing an assortment of muffins baked by the Sisters of Mercy. The day had begun crystal clear, bright sunshine. But by the time they had packed the cars and trucks and driven off, they'd been cloaked in a fog so dense that no one could ever follow them. Jimmy realized now that the fog which hid Grace's escape must have been Leo's doing. Just as he now knew that the person responsible for harassing him on his visits to Grace and the burglar in her apartment were one and the same, Lucas Redding. But at the time, he and Grace attributed everything to the bad neighborhood. Indeed, things were peaceful once they were settled into Jimmy's Squirrel Hill house. So peaceful that Jimmy was able to procure enough grant money to allow him another trip to Ireland that summer. After he'd proven, with Grace's suggestion, that he used mitochondrial DNA from the bones she'd inadvertently taken from Maeve's hand, that it was in fact the ancient warrior queen herself buried at the base of the cairn. Grace, finished with her residency, took time off to accompany him before beginning her search for a real job. Jimmy tried to remember if Leo had a hand in that as well, but couldn't. But he did remember the awful day of the explosion. The day when everything had changed for his research, for the world. Brothers in Blood. Knocknaria, era 1651, BC. The days should have been getting longer, but a constant grey mist shrouded everything in Maeve's land when finally she returned from her quest to find salvation for her people. Gone were her fertile green fields and woods, replaced by brown bracken and withered trees with few buds brave enough to show themselves. Maeve rushed up the last hillside separating her from her people, a pang of fear making her stomach tumble. Would they have survived the harsh winter? How many would be left for her to save? To her surprise, when she reached the hilltop, she spied a well-ordered collection of huts circled together around a large cooking area. Smoke drifted lazily from the center of each roof, but no one appeared outside. Unable to contain herself, Maeve ran down the hill, followed by Timur and Melis, the two Callistians who had accompanied her. She stopped at the outer perimeter of the settlement and waved them back, drawing her sword. A tall man with regal bearing emerged from the largest hut, stretching as if he had just woken. Lothar. Her brother, the chieftain she'd left in charge of her people during her absence. Smiling at his obviously healthy appearance, she strode forward, lowering her sword. He turned at her approach and began to call out a warning, then stopped, his mouth open in astonishment. He rushed to her, clasping her arms in a strong grip, shaking her, as if he wasn't certain if she were real. They said you'd been lost to the Selkies, he said. He turned and called out, "Come, see your fallen queen. Maeve has returned to serve her people." Slowly the huts emptied of men, followed by women and only a handful of children, all girls, Maeve noted with surprise. The old ones were all gone, she had feared they might not survive the winter. But the men, her warriors, appeared hale and strong. To her surprise, her people held back, not venturing farther than their doorways, staring and pointing at her and the two Callista. Selkies, she heard the word whispered more than once, accompanied by fearful glances in their direction. The Selkies were the ancient sea people, who took the form of seals in the water and humans on land. They were known for their cunning, vicious ways, tricking real people out of their lands, their lives, their souls. And they could only be killed while in their human form. "No, not Selkies," Maeve said, stepping into the center clearing and turning around so her people could see that she was whole, unharmed. "These are friends. They have come to offer their aid in our time of need. Together we will survive this never-ending winter." Instead of cheers, her words were received with frowns from the men and puzzled looks from the women. Lothar waved two of the men over. "Take our guests and show them our hospitality. Ready a feast to welcome our queen," he instructed. "Maeve and I have much to discuss." As he led Maeve into his hut, she spied a young girl scurrying to hide beneath a pile of furs. "Leave me," Lothar told the frightened girl, never using her name or looking her in the face. Maeve watched as the girl, barely showing even faint signs of womanhood, raced from the hut. Her stomach knotted as she spun to face her brother. "Why is that girl here in your quarters?" He shrugged as if it were of little consequence. "All of us must learn to serve, for the good of all," he said, straightening to his full height and frowning down on her. "Even you, Maeve." She grew rigid, her hand falling to clasp her sword. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Her voice was low, commanding. He took a step back, regarding her as if coming to a decision. "I am your queen. I know what is best for the good of all my people." "Do you?" he asked, his voice neutral now. "I suppose so. Forgive me, my queen," he bowed his head, "it has been a long, bitter winter since you left us. Many have suffered, many have been lost. You and the other men look healthy. Have you found food?" A sly smile flitted across his face. "We've made good use of the food provided. As you'll see at the feast." Indeed, as he spoke, a thick oily smell of roasting meat began to fill the hut. The Callista ate no flesh, she'd become unaccustomed to the scent, and the smell made Maeve's stomach heave. "There's no need for a feast. We need to pack. The Callista have offered their hospitality to all. They've secret ways. More than I can explain now, but with their help we'll all live through this to see the sun again." His chuckle surprised her. A harsh, brittle sound, it made the hackles on the back of her neck raise. "The good of our people may not lie where you assume it does, Maeve. We've found new ways while you slept with the Selkies. I told you, they are not Selkies. They are men, just like you." "No, not like me. And not men, not anymore. What have you done?" she demanded as she ran to the door. The stench of burning flesh grew. A large fire blazed in the cooking pit. Arranged around it were the men, behind them were arrayed the women, some one to a man, a few men with two. She barely recognized most of them, they appeared cowed, their shoulders hunched, heads hung. Except for a few who glared at her, as if afraid that she'd return to steal away what little they had left. As she watched in horror, she saw one of the men tug his woman onto his lap, and begin to drink from her breasts, with the loud suckling noises of an animal. Suddenly she realized why there were no infants, no boys left alive. Any man-child might grow to challenge the warriors, and any infants would need their mother's milk. Lothar approached her from behind, as she tried to take in what she was seeing. How could this happen? These weren't her people, the thriving, vibrant community she'd left behind. Lothar grabbed her arm, pulled her to him. "You too can serve my warriors," he whispered into her ear. "Never." She reached for his hand, twisted a finger back until he yielded. He released her but then shoved her hard, so that she stumbled to the edge of the cooking pit. The churning in her bowels worsened as she choked in the rank, oily smoke that blinded her. "Then there are other ways you can be of use." Lothar's mocking laughter encircled her, as she struggled to clear her vision. "It's all for the greater good, Maeve. For the good of the people." The smoke cleared and she caught her first sight of what was roasting below her in the pit. Melis and Timur's bodies sizzled in the fire, their skin blackened and cracked, the juices of their muscles making the flames spit and dance around them. "No," she choked out the word, spinning to Lothar, her sword at the ready. "They were our hope, our salvation. They were innocent." He merely smiled, waving his men back. "We are our own salvation, Maeve. We need no one, not even you, to lead us. We make our own laws, we are our own gods." His words split the air between them. Maeve staggered back. Her vision clouded by the flames of her own disgust and fury, she charged him. His sword snaked from its sheath and he quickly parried her first blow. She forced herself to calm down, to think like a warrior, cast aside her anger. Lothar was her best warrior. It would take all she had to defeat him, even with the help of the Callistian sword she carried, a blade so sharp that it could cleave a man's head from his body, given the right stroke. Not that Lothar would be likely to give her such an opening. He swung his sword, feinted, then parried once more, toying with her. His laughter was louder than the crackle of the fire at her back. "Do you want to join them?" he asked, his smile revealing all his teeth. "Or me?" Who was this stranger? Where was the brother who had fought so often at her side? "I'll join you in hell." As the night falls, the secrets of grace and the truth of this hospital are slowly revealed. Don't go away, subscribe to our channel to uncover the next astonishing truth.